Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Daisy Zamora, who served as a frontline combatant, called the women's role in Nicaragua's Sandinista revolution the revolution inside the revolution. Women made up as many as 30% of the combatants at the height of the 1979 rebellion to overthrow their country's U.S.-backed dictator, but their story has largely been erased from the official histories. In her new documentary called Las Sandinistas, Jenny Murray gives a voice to the women warriors and social revolutionaries who shattered barriers as FSLN leaders, both in combat and in the fight for social reform, and then in what followed, the U.S.-backed Contra-war and a continuing struggle for justice in their troubled country. Jenny Murray's film is currently being shown at Film Forum on West Howson Street, and it brings her to our show now. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Leonard.
Isn't this your first feature film? What got you interested in telling this story of all the stories to start with?
Yes, it is my first feature. It happened to have a lot of themes and a lot of the exciting histories of women that I think are largely overlooked in the traditional narratives of history that we learn, and it combined a lot of themes, the fight for equality and the bravery and heroism of women. So those things really excited me, and Latin American history as well.
How had Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza Debayle come to power in 1967?
Well, his father had been in charge of the country. And in the 30s, he worked with the U.S. Marines and rose to prominence in the Nicaraguan National Guard, and obviously spoke fluent English, and was a favorite among the Marines and the U.S. generals that were stationed there. So he took power, and then his other son, had taken power briefly as well. And the former Somoza was assassinated by a poet, and the young Anastasio Somoza, who we see in the film in the 1960s coming to power, had actually gone to West Point and had trained in the U.S. and was educated in the U.S. And when he returned to Nicaragua, obviously had a prominent role because of his father and his family still being more or less in power the whole time.
And it didn't hurt that he spoke English. That allowed him to have a lot of contact with the U.S. government. Absolutely.
And having, his father, they'd had a close relationship with many members of the U.S. government throughout the years, and that helped a lot, I think, with ensuring that they could get certain kinds of support and stay in power.
How did he acquire his wealth? And at the height of his power, how much was he actually worth?
Some estimates say $500 million or even more at the height of his power, which is pretty wild. And in the film, we have an interview with Dan Rather, where Dan Rather questions him about this in some news archives. And, he says it was only $100 million, but that the people who adversed him said that it was more. But again, at the height of their power, they owned tons of land. They owned, all the media stations. They owned shipping ports. And there was a port called Port Somoza, and they had just a ton of hotels and airlines and essentially different kinds of monopolies throughout the country, which ensured that they could keep accumulating wealth and keep concentrating that power.
In a country where most of the people were rather poor, what was life like for the average Nicaraguan family? And what kinds of work were available for, I'm assuming, mostly men? Did many women work at that time?
Some women worked. It depended on their class background and sort of, how they grew up. At the time, not a lot of women were working. However, if you were born, one of our characters, Claudia Alonso, was born on a farm, and many of the farmers in Campesino women worked to support their families. and but obviously with very little power in their own families for the most part. Women were generally expected to stay home and take care of kids, no matter what class they were from. That was sort of
although in your
trajectory.
When she's asked her former occupation, Nora Astorga, who is an FSLN member, answers corporate lawyer.
Right. Right. That's one of my favorite parts of the archives, because it just shows the range of women that left their homes and really went to fight, and how much actually you sacrifice when you leave a career like in corporate law. Nora was, one of the few women who was able to get educated abroad and had worked abroad, and she was also in Nicaragua for a long time. When she came back, she had become a corporate lawyer at a prestigious firm, and that was actually how her involvement with the FSLN began.
But wouldn't she, as a member of the establishment, have been more likely to have sided with Somoza?
You would think so, right? And I think that's why it's partly so surprising for me, and one of the things that was the most electrifying and interesting about women's role is that women of all classes fought. There were prominent members of aristocratic families. One, Claudia Chamorro, had left her family and was killed in combat, and was a member of one of the highest-ranking families in the country. And so Nora Astorga, she had left and made that decision to start getting involved. At first, slowly, and at first, she still kept her day job, as they say. And but the average Nicaraguan woman, and I think the average Nicaraguan, they suffered greatly, and there were very few resources. The leading causes of death and infant mortality. I mean, you had disease and malnourishment and a lack of potable water and clean water, and so people really fought. I think some people fought really to just get such basic resources that many people struggled with, and farmers struggled maintaining their own lands, and fighting for labor unions and fair treatment.
How did it compare to other Central American countries? Nicaragua probably had a larger indigenous population.
At the time, actually, in El Salvador and Guatemala, you saw similar struggles in the decades surrounding the Nicaraguan struggle, and I think you had a lot of very similar circumstances. Large populations that didn't really have access to literacy or higher education in any significant way, and a great amount of poverty and disease. And certainly in Guatemala, there was a huge indigenous population, and a genocide, what people call a genocide, where 200,000 Guatemalans had been killed under their dictatorship, and many joined the guerrilla eventually as well. And Nicaragua, so I think they shared a lot of similarities, maybe more than people like in the U.S. would understand or could identify with. Certainly large U.S. corporate interests came in many of the countries, and so people were expected to work very cheaply.
Now, we're talking about 1967 as the beginning of the Sandinista rebellion. There was a lot of political activity going on in the United States at the time as well, and in Europe. So was was the resistance something that was kind of international? With regard to Nicaragua, or you mean in general, that sort of sense of revolution? Well, in France, there were students rebelling against the government. In the United States, of course, there were people marching against the war, leading to, 1968 is the key year, but 67, things were already starting. And here in Nicaragua, you have student, labor, and political groups going underground to fight for change. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think that had a lot. I think that energy and that social atmosphere did have a lot to do with the Nicaraguan Revolution, and specifically one of the women in our film profile, Lea Guido, who became the Minister of Health, the first Minister of Health. And she had been in France for the student uprisings, actually, and she founded the first women's group, AMLI, in Nicaragua, and really brought women together. And she had trained, really on the streets
and had participated in the student uprisings in France in the 60s. She had been lucky enough to have a family that could send her to Europe to study. And so she learned to speak French, and she came back, and we have archives of her speaking French with some interviewers and talking about, how she had come and been inspired to found, a movement to support women and to bring people from the countryside together at these early stages, of the first kind of civil mobilization and the first sort of broad-based groupings of the revolution. And Sophia, who's in this film also, she'd studied in the U.S. and said she was greatly influenced by seeing the women's movement on TV in Miami when she had come. Her parents had sent her away after a massacre in the 60s. And she was just incredibly moved to learn about what feminism was. She said it was almost, this kind of literature was unavailable for most Nicaraguans. And she learned on the U.S. TV about the anti-war movement and just saw women doing such incredible things that she felt like she had to go back to her country and bring that knowledge and start organizing.
You tell the story of the Sandinistas through the stories of Dora Maria Tellez, a young medical student who became a major Sandinista general, and 4 other women revolutionaries. Now, Dora Maria comes across as a remarkable figure, a born leader. What is she doing these days?
Yeah, she's an incredible human being. And throughout the struggle, she was just such an important part of almost every stage of the struggle. And today she is, essentially what she's told me is that she's living in clandestinity all over again. And she, in the 90s, founded a party called the MRS, the Sandinista Renovation Movement. And she's been more or less kind of fighting with them for reforms, specifically for clean and transparent elections. She staged a highly publicized hunger strike in the mid-2000s. And she also, she studied extensively. She's written a book on Nicaraguan history. She's, obviously she was a medical student, and so she did a lot of health work. She became the second minister of health in the government, in the Sandinista government. And but unfortunately, she's back in a situation where she's fighting again on the streets and protesting and trying to organize to bring change to the country.
What about the other women who were in leadership positions? They all also been kind of minimalized?
Yes, most of them have. In different ways and at different times. But the majority of women who were, very prominent leaders like Dora Maria Tellez and Leah Guido and Daisy Zamora, who was the Vice Minister of Culture. Joconda Belli, who was a leader of the ministry that did kind of promotion and publicity for the government. Many of them ended up either being fired or leaving in different ways. There are certain women who did fight and are still with the government that we tried to interview. That never were, they weren't ministers the way that Dora or Leah Guido were, or Daisy. But they served the party and continued to. Doris Tijerino, Leticia Herrera was their equivalent of a Supreme Court justice, and Leticia was actually fired in 2014 when we were doing our second shoot. And some say it was because she published her memoir, and that, people say that the current government is against certain publications of these memories, and we certainly tried to interview these women. We didn't want to just, take that at face value. We wanted to try, and so, we tried about a dozen women, including Amita Granera, who was a nun, a former nun, and the head of police for many years in the Sandinista government, and she also recently parted ways with the government from her post as the head of police. So it's a very complex story, and the mission of this film, one of my missions, was to at least preserve that legacy and that heroism and that leadership and the incredible gains that these women made, the best that we could.
I'm speaking on Leonard Lopate at Large with Jenny Murray, whose film Las Sandinistas, the stirring, timely, untold chronicle of the bold women behind Nicaragua's Sandinista movement, is currently being shown at Film Forum. This is WBAI New York, 99.5 FM. What was Donna Maria's upbringing like? Was she brought up to take a leadership role?
Dora's upbringing was really interesting. She had a brother, and her family was middle class, originally from León and Matagalpa. And she grew up near Matagalpa, and her father, she said she was raised in a house with a lot of love and with parents who really cared about her education, that both her and her brother's education was a priority, and that she had a very untraditional house in Nicaragua where, her father taught her a lot of things, and taught her to shoot weapons and really treated her in an equal environment with her brother, and said she could do any career that she wanted, and she had originally considered being an archaeologist, but her father said, you might starve with a career like that in Nicaragua. So she thought that was funny, but then eventually agreed and, decided to study medicine, which, again, was very rare for a woman in Nicaragua. And, a woman at any time in most parts of the world in that era. So she, as a high school student, became involved in supporting workers' movements and pension protests and became a leader of her high school movement. And I think just really dreamed of supporting a world that was more equal. Her father, growing up, had told her that class differences among people were an artificial thing and that they created barriers among people, which, again, for a member of the middle class in Nicaragua, which was very small, that was also a very rare message to get. And so she ended up becoming a medical student, studying medicine in college, and that's where she would be in hospitals helping women with no means give birth, and she saw the amount of infant mortality and just the amount of sickness. And she said it was a systemic problem in her experience that you would, cure someone for a few days, but because they would go back to these conditions, they would just return again, or children would die. And she felt very powerless as, a medical student trainee and felt the system had to be changed.
In a traditionally male-dominated society, were the male FSLN leaders fairly enlightened when it came to women doing things like leading combat and playing other kinds of leadership roles?
Mm-hmm. It seems that in a remarkable way, in terms of the leadership that a lot of the women were able to attain within the FSLN structure, certainly before the insurrection, it seems that certainly some of the men really were, and that a lot of the women I spoke to, they didn't talk about ever experiencing, the kind of harassment that we've heard about, for example, in the U.S. military, or, the same kinds of barriers to frontline combat, which obviously was a huge debate in the U.S., even in the last few years. There's still been a debate, should women fight in the front lines? And many of them said it was this remarkable period of time where men did support them fighting. Again, Pastora, who's in the film, had a lot of women that fought with him, and he said that as long as a revolutionary was willing to die, was willing to walk and give their life, it didn't matter what their gender was. And he was proud to serve with women, and he said they did extraordinary things. On the other hand, some people said, well, they just needed more soldiers, and at that point they would have taken anyone that could be a soldier. So some people, the counter-argument that some people have given me in interviews is that, they really just needed soldiers. And so it was important that women came insofar as, they were more, they just helped build the numbers.
Although they also were making battle plans and leading soldiers into combat, which is more than just being members of the troops. Absolutely.
And Dora Maria masterminded the success of León, which was the first city to fall in a huge city in the revolution. And to hear her story is that she's very, very nonchalant almost when she speaks about it. She just says, that she says she did what she had to do, and she does speak very, very strategically. And in the length of a feature film, you can't get into all the strategy for that particular battle, but it's just incredible the way that she thought to cut off roads, the way that they had to take certain posts strategically first, the way to surround certain enemy troops. just really radical ideas, and she had studied so carefully, military strategies. And Monica Boltodano as well. She led the taking of Granada, which was another huge and important strategic city. And even in the film, you probably saw the anecdote where the National Guard troops said he wouldn't surrender to a woman, even though it was very clear at that point that she had won the battle. And so even at that moment, they were still kind of fighting those battles for gender equality in their own ways.
Did the FSLN have a cohesive political philosophy? Did they declare themselves anti-imperialist? Ronald Reagan later accused them of being communists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've spoken to the women about that very specifically because we got such a specific perspective in the United States at that time. I wasn't actually alive for half the Contra War, but from the archives and from the first-hand testimonies and from speaking to even many of my parents' friends, they were considered communists in the U.S. media, or they were called communists. And, when
Somoza called them communists.
Absolutely. And Somoza knew about the U.S. media. He knew the exact buzzwords to say and how to spin anything. I think partly from his time in the United States, but also having been an ally of the United States for so long. So they were very clever. And, when I spoke to Dora Maria about it, she said, we weren't communists. And, essentially, we were anti-imperialist, which was never really a communist position if you look back at the Soviet Union.
Did that mean opposed to the U.S.'s involvement in Central America?
Yes.
Because we had overthrown governments in Central America.
Yeah, and throughout Latin America, absolutely. And, in Chile, you had Pinochet and CIA involvement. You'd had this even in, the ensuing years and the years leading up to the revolution. And so, the anti-imperialist stance was one of the policies. They were against military intervention and the overthrowing of governments. But obviously the kind of intervention that was supportive or diplomatic. At the same time, there were a lot of people from the U.S. that came, especially after the revolution, to do solidarity work and to publicize what was going on. And journalists were there in huge numbers. And so obviously that kind of intervention. And as Daisy says, they read a lot of U.S. poetry, and there was really beautiful kinds of U.S. intervention at the same time. But the military intervention was one of the main, anti-U.S. military intervention was one of their main principles. And obviously liberation theology was also huge, which was something very hard for me to wrap my mind around. But this idea that priests, Catholic priests like Ernesto Cardenal and nuns and were getting involved in the military struggle and were supporting the FSLN. And this was something I think that many Latin Americans understand and have experience with, so that actually people in the FSLN had a strong Catholic background, which was also not communist traditionally, to have a movement. And Monica Boltodano became involved because of her experience with the Christian movement and Christian activism. And so there were people that fought with, this very, very different and very, not a traditional military background in any way.
And then in December 1972, an earthquake rocked Managua, the capital city of Nicaragua. Beside this devastation, what was the political significance of the earthquake?
The earthquake was, it was a huge turning point, I think, for the country and for many of the activists that were rising up against the Somozas. And at that time there were tons of groups, and we don't have the time to speak about it in the film, but there was a communist party in Nicaragua, which was not the FSLN. There was a socialist party.
So this is there was not a unified opposition? These were all working independently?
Yeah, and I think, there was overlap. And, there were student activist groups which were separate as well. There was a Maoist group, and they were, initially, I think, especially until the mid to late 70s when things really began to coalesce, they were all working and they were distinct groups. They differed on the idea of military struggle or, what the new society should look like. They had, ideological differences, which were very nuanced and very, very sophisticated, especially Coming from my background, I grew up in Chicago in the United States, and the idea that there were that many parties in this small country was incredible. And then the earthquake came, like you mentioned, and poverty and just the desperation of the majority of the people was really, just catapulted to an extreme level by the earthquake. Somoza was said to have stolen a lot of the earthquake aid that had come, and people were without homes. 10,000 people died. Some say up to 30,000 eventually, with the lack of food and the lack of resources and homes. So many homes were destroyed, and everyone that was there remembers it. It was just devastating. In an instant, thousands of people were killed, and they had so little infrastructure to rebuild. And obviously, the Somozas, it wasn't their priority to restore the majority of the country back to the way it was. So at that point, I think people, repression grew after the earthquake. You see often in countries when there's a national disaster, the grip on power can become tighter, and civil liberties and freedoms that people enjoyed, start to disappear. And so Somoza and the military took a tighter grip on the country. And so the resistance became, there were massacres, and things became very terrifying for a lot of people. So I think that really galvanized a lot of the women, and they got much more involved.
But this is when the Sandinista Front, or the FSLN, actually became to be considered the vanguard of the Nicaraguan people. So they became a unifying force. Did they state any goals, any specific goals, other than the overthrow of Somoza?
Yeah, it was a process, I think, because Carlos Fonseca, one of the original founders, was killed in 1976, and so you had a lot of leaders in hiding. It was very compartmentalized, but it was, I guess it was around 1978, the death of the journalist Pedro Joaquin Chamorro really, again, galvanized a huge amount of people in the country. This journalist who was beloved and was, not considered a radical, but was considered anti-Somoza, and publicized a lot of news that ran counter to Somoza's aims. A lot of people began to join after his assassination in 1978. And I think at that point, it really seemed that the FSLN, like Sophia says, she decided to switch to the FSLN party when it became clear that this was the party that seemed most able to topple the dictator. And they had the clearest and what seemed like the most viable plan. They, by the late 70s, they had switched kind of policies to really broaden the base of support. There were three different tendencies in the FSLN. People had different ideas about how to accomplish a revolution. Some thought you should concentrate, in the cities and gather workers. Some thought you should, stage rural warfare. But by the late 70s, and with the Ortegas coming to prominence, the Ortega brothers in the party and in the national leadership of the party, the plan sort of became much more broad-based. And they really recruited a lot of young people, especially after the National Palace and the first insurrection.
Did it split up families? What did it mean for an 18-year-old student to go underground and join the FSLN?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it split families, sometimes right down the center, or just a few members of the family would go and fight on one side or the other. And Sofia Montenegro in the film, her brother and her father were part of Somoza's army. And she had made the choice, again, after, learning about the women's movement and learning about different leftist movements, to join the FSLN. And she knew, that she would probably end up fighting her own brother. And, she was from, again, a middle-class family. And, this went down, class lines. These divisions were just radical in families. And, in the Civil War in the United States, I guess we have something akin, but it's so long ago. And, for these families, it was a huge and devastating reality for so many Nicaraguan families. Mm-hmm.
Where were they getting their guns and ammunition?
They got it different places. I think some were smuggled in. They got it from a lot of different sources, and they didn't always speak about where they got it from. So, I and I'm not 100% sure where every piece of ammo came from. But when they'd win a battle against the National Guard, they would take those weapons. And as they started winning more battles, I think they ended up with a lot of weapons from the National Guard. Many of Somoza's weapons came from the United States, and so they did end up with better weapons, certainly by the end. But most of them, I mean, like Claudia talks about how, many of them just had shotguns or pistols. They had, relatively basic weapons, especially for the first years of the struggle. I mean, really, really scant and meager weapons. So, yeah, most of them came from farms, came from friends or people in the local towns that would supply their local weapons. But generally, they were very poorly armed for the many years leading up to the last insurrection.
Talking with Jenny Murray, whose film Las Sandinistas is currently being shown at Film Forum on West Houston Street, and it tells the story of the women of the revolution. Now, where did they train, and who was training them?
They trained all over. They trained in the countryside, and they trained sometimes in safe houses, in the edges of cities, and in Cuba. So Dora Maria and Olga Aviles, who's in the film, went to Cuba to train, sometimes with people that had trained with Che Guevara. And Dora Maria went to train in military medicine in the mountains in Cuba as well.
So Cuba was a major source. What about the Soviet Union?
Some had visited the Soviet Union. From what I've read, Leticia Herrera visited the Soviet Union and a few other members. The Soviet Union played a larger role after the victory during the Contra War. But some had been educated there, some had visited.
But meanwhile,
I think it was unclear. Yeah.
Meanwhile, Somoza's government. I'm sorry. Somoza's government and the National Guard seem to be killing people indiscriminately: students, old people, women, children. Did they consider anyone to be a possible member of the FSLN?
At that time, yes. I think there was a great paranoia, and Claudia Alonso, who's in the film, says that just based on your last name, if you had the same last name as someone who was suspected to be a member of the FSLN, they would come. And she saw most of her family members killed. And many of the people in the countryside, I think, lived in great, great fear. Because even if you were just accused, you could be pulled into jail, you could be tortured and killed. And many women were raped by the National Guard. It was a very frightening time for a lot of people in the country.
The FSLN had a number of victories. First, an early one was their raid on the Castillo House in late 1974. And then later, there was the raid on the National Palace in 1978, a real turning point in the war. What was the Sandinista strategy in these victories? What were they hoping to achieve, and what was Somoza's response?
They were hoping to achieve prominence, I think, and they were hoping to achieve a kind of visibility that, as a clandestine movement, they certainly didn't have. And they were trying to build their name, I think, so that they could obviously recruit more members. And with the Castillo raid, at the end of the raid, they were able to negotiate their terms. And one of the things that they demanded was a publication in the newspapers and on the radio that said, this is the Sandinista Liberation Front. And, they had a whole set of slogans and phrases that they insisted were published as the terms of leaving that raid. And they also asked for a salary raise for the National Guard. And so they had a very specific mission, I think, and they wanted that to be as clear as possible. They also asked for money, obviously, to support the cause and the freedom of political prisoners. Many FS1 prisoners were in jail, so these raids were opportunities for them, one of the few opportunities for them to get different important members of the FS1 out of jail. And both of those raids, they were able to do it, which is pretty incredible.
Now, the raid on the National Palace, they chose a small, inexperienced number of fighters, including a number of women, for a very important military raid. Weren't they afraid that the thing might fail?
I think they were always afraid. Most of the women will say they were always afraid that each day, you really did feel like it could be your last day alive. But I think Dora Maria, when she was chosen to head negotiations at the National Palace, she had earned a lot of trust from the upper leadership of the FSLN, partly from her Cuba training, and she had come back to Nicaragua in 1977 and had really shown herself in battle to be extremely strong, extremely intelligent, extremely reliable, extremely brave. And so they chose her also because she had such a calm head that they could really trust her to carry out, the mission and, stay on course. So it was a really incredible thing. She was referred to as number 2 at that raid. So she was, one of the top 3 in command. And that was an incredible moment, I think, for the women, especially the ones fighting in the FSLN, because it was such a prominent role and such a high leadership role. And Dora Maria did such a great job.
Now, how is this
she really carried out the negotiations?
How is this playing out in the United States? Didn't the Carter administration lend the Somoza government $150 million?
Yeah, through the World Bank and through different allies, they were supporting the Somoza government, and
not just Ronald Reagan, but Jimmy Carter as well.
Yeah. And Jimmy Carter had written Somoza a handwritten letter that congratulated Somoza on his improvement in human rights, and Somoza kept it framed in his office and was so proud of this letter from Jimmy Carter. And he would show it to everyone, and it's hard to believe, that this is sort of how the foreign policy went, but that's the way it was at the time. And I think that FSLN was very scared as well when it seemed that support would continue for Somoza, and that was part of the incentive for planning the National Palace raid, because if more support and money were coming, it was going to make the situation even more dire.
But then came the 1979 massacre of Sandinista leaders at Leon, Nicaragua's second largest city. Dora Maria was sent there to take back the city. How was she able to get all the organized political forces to work together?
Dora's very strategic, and it was not easy. And she explained that, first there had been a massacre in Veracruz leading up to Dora's battles in Leon, where a large number of the leaders of the FSLN in Leon were killed at a raid by the National Guard, including one of her good friends, Adania Fernandez. And it was just devastating for her emotionally. And if you can imagine 6 of your closest friends and allies just being killed in one foul swoop, and then you're sort of the only one left. So that's how she began that battle, which is just incredible. And she was sent to take charge, and she said when she got there, it was almost anarchistic. There was, people would go home to take a bath, and you thought you'd have a whole regiment ready for battle, and they'd be at their friends eating breakfast. It's hard to imagine the way that the level of disorganization that she walked into. And but she was able to harness, I think, a number of people, and then also recruit a lot of local people in Leon through having a very clear plan. And she was very organized, and really just had a very clear vision of exactly where people should be at what time, and what the strategy was going to be. To isolate the National Guard troops, to cut off the National Guard support, and the goal was always to have simultaneous battles going on. And so even within Leon, she always had a multifaceted strategy to separate the National Guard, to divvy up their forces, to cut off roads so big equipment couldn't come in, and support the battles for the National Guard. And so, to cut off food or resources into the National Guard's forts. So she was always, one of the strategies was really to just cut off and isolate them on a hill. They had a bunker on a hill that was a very strategic location. She was just incredible at managing people, and I think her organization was the key.
What ultimately led President Somoza to leave the country for exile in Miami in July 1979? Did he think he was losing the war?
It seemed, I think at that point, it seemed very clear to him, and he never said this to his troops, by the way. He left them practically abandoned, including Sophia's brother. He just disappeared. But he went into exile in Miami, I think when he thought it was clear, after a number of the cities had fallen, there was just no way. And so, yeah, his troops were spread out, and it just seemed, I think he was very clear that there was no way forward, and that at that point, U.S. military aid was not coming. And some of the newscasts you see in the film, you can see him desperately asking for American support in English, just begging the newscasters to broadcast and to help him get support. And, really at that point, he needed much more than the U.S. was willing to give him, because the U.S., I think, also didn't know exactly how it was going to go.
Did the Sandinistas immediately declare victory?
I think it took a little bit of time, but very, very shortly after.
And when they came to power, they formed a 9-member national directorate, all male, including Daniel Ortega. Why wasn't Dora Maria made a member, since she played such an important role in the insurrection?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's one of the questions of our film, too, one of the central questions in the film. Dora Maria seemed like a natural for the directorate, and that's a lot of women and a lot of the former FSLN members said the same thing. And, on some level, during the insurrection, it seemed like a very natural thing to have a woman leader and to have a woman in power. And then, shortly after victory, things changed a bit. And, the mentality shifted a little bit. And, at first, there was a junta that came to power, and Violeta Chamorro was part of that junta. And, but as soon as the FSLN solidified power with their directorate, Dora Maria was not a part of it. And, to be fair, Eden Pastora was also not a part of it. And he's in the film as well, and, ended up becoming a Contra leader. So there were a number of protagonists. It wasn't just the women. A number of protagonists weren't, part of the directorate. But at the same time, it was very clear that women, especially when they started trying to fight for their own women's movement and, to prioritize different women's issues, that was going to be a struggle, and that wasn't going to happen on its own.
Were women's rights considered when they wrote the new Constitution?
Well, women did organize, and Gioconda speaks about this in the film, Gioconda Belli and Sofia Montenegro. That first they wanted to have their own movement, but you had to have a member. What the leadership of the party said is you had to have a leader of the party kind of running the women's movement inside the organization. And so, they tried to find creative and imaginative ways to still put together reforms for women, especially during the Constitution while it was being drafted. And, Gioconda talks about, a number of reforms they were able to get into the Constitution, or at least approved in the country. And so it took effort, and I think they did. But women did begin to band together in a very large and beautiful way and really talk about their priorities, talk about the policies that they wanted to see enacted. And, they did say that Gioconda, one of the issues was abortion, and that was something that, for whatever reason, they were not willing to put into the Constitution.
And is it abortion illegal right now in Nicaragua?
And now it's federally illegal, yeah. Under the Sandinistas approved this and have left this policy. Yeah, so...
But there was a literacy campaign, and national health was improved, so there were positive things. Meanwhile, in 1981, President Reagan declared the Sandinista government a communist reign of terror, and he helped the Contra fighters form. Was he supplying them with money? Well, I guess we know the answer because we know about Iran-Contra.
Exactly. Yeah. And there were some incredible reforms, what Noam Chomsky called the most effective social reforms in the hemisphere. And certainly I think health and literacy and, Daisy's Ministry of Culture were among the top and the most successful of all the reforms.
So why was the U.S. government so opposed to the social reforms that were being enacted in Nicaragua?
It's a good question, and it's a deep question, Leonard. I think, it's obviously not something that Ronald Reagan in interviews talks about with a lot of nuance. So I think part of the fear was obviously this was a Cold War era, a Cold War era issue, and at least what Ronald Reagan would say is that they were afraid that, and other people involved with the administration or supporting the Contra War would say is that they were terrified that communism, or whatever the threat of it, would spread. And, countries like El Salvador or, Guatemala and other places, in our backyard, effectively, they were very terrified, I think, of having a huge block of countries that were not allied with U.S. interests at our borders. And so under Ronald Reagan, they worked very hard and funneled resources in different ways and, led covert operations to help arm and to support the Contras and to, with different manuals. There are CIA manuals, and you can find them online, some of them, and, really to lead a war, in different ways, a propaganda war and also sort of a military and, war throughout the country to destabilize and to overthrow the Sandinistas.
And how long did the war with the Contras last?
The better part of a decade, really almost a decade.
But then in 1990, Ortega and the FSLN lost an election to Violeta Chamorro. Were the Contras already no longer fighting?
I think there were still hostilities, and it was unclear. I think most of the people voted, or many people voted, I think out of fear that the war would continue.
So Violeta Chamorro was a U.S. supported candidate. What did she campaign for? Did she say she was going to eliminate everything that the FSLN had enacted?
Violeta, I think, was very intelligent, and a lot of people really saw her as kind of unifying a peaceful figure. And, Violeta was also the widow of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, the beloved journalist who had been killed before the insurrections. And so she was a mother with a lot of kids and a lot of experience, in the national spotlight in Nicaragua. And, she campaigned, I think, with this idea of peace and of restoring some of the, the basic, rights to different Nicaraguans who had felt disenfranchised under the Sandinistas, or who had felt like, their businesses had suffered, or, she campaigned with this promise of just a better world and repairing the country after the war and reversing some of the policies. So I think people really did know that the war would likely stop her, and that was part of the reason she won.
But then 16 years later, Daniel Ortega was voted back into power in 2006. Now, in your film, people described Dora Maria as one of the most brilliant minds in the country. Did she hold any positions in the early government, or was she pretty much elbowed out from the start?
Dora Maria she at first led the military region of Leon and Chinandega right after the victory, and then she did organizing work. She led mass groups. And in 1985, she became the health minister. So that was a really important position, especially during the Contra War. She oversaw, a really effective, with the amount of limited resources and the embargo. Dora Maria really effectively distributed aid and distributed medical supplies and support throughout the country, which was devastated by war, certainly by, the mid-'80s. And so that was a very important position. However, she wasn't a leader of the directorate at that point. And, by the early 1990s, there was a lot of talk of Dora Maria. Certainly by 1990, I think, talk of her being elected to the directorate. But, by the time she was supposed to be nominated, she had been asked to step aside, essentially, asked not to run.
And she says in your film, the people in power today are trying to erase everyone. All the women who had been in leadership positions are being eliminated from the history?
Well, many who are opponents of the current government are being erased, certainly. Certain protagonists that were part of the history, as long as they're allied with the Ortegas, it seems that they can be part of the history. Eden Pastora is one that they mention in that interview, who has, allied with Daniel Ortega and is now, his role in the National Palace is something that's spoken about and is still looked up to, and so there's certain people that are still with Daniel Ortega, I think, are certainly part of the narrative still, but people like Dora Maria, people like Monica Boltadano, you don't hear much about. And I think it seems very strategic. And, in Dora's words, they're erasing those people from history entirely because it's not convenient to the current political narrative.
And what about the social programs and health programs that the Sandinistas put into place in the early 1980s? We mentioned that abortion has now been made illegal again. What about some of the other things? Did the literacy programs continue? Has health and education been better?
So literacy after the FS1 left power, literacy went down again. The levels of literacy that they had achieved during the revolution and shortly after, sadly, really regressed. Now, when Daniel Ortega came back to power in the last few years, they've gotten some gains back to their credit. There has been some improvement in literacy, although it's still not at the level of improvement that they saw within a year of the victory of the revolution. However, there's some improvement, and there is free education. Although Dora Maria and many of the women who have been involved in the ministries argue that the level of education is still very low, and in fact, it's not a great system. And
you also report on unpunished rapes occurring in the country. Is there kind of a return to machismo in this new government?
Yes. So when Daniel Ortega came back to power, he allied with the Catholic Church. And obviously one of the policies of the Catholic Church is a kind of anti-abortion stance. And the culture has changed in some very disturbing ways. Monica Boltadano speaks about the increase in rape, the increase in femicide, which is, a gender-based killing of a woman, often by someone close to her, like a boyfriend or a brother or a husband. And so, there are many groups that watch the rates of femicide. And, so there's been a disturbing increase in violence against women and murders of women and young girls being raped, obviously. In the film, Ruth Marina, who's the head of a group called Venancia in the North, talks about, the rates of girls who are 11 to 14 being raped and impregnated and having nothing, no recourse, essentially. And the Sandinistas also, there's a new law about mediation, which went into effect a few years ago, which when a woman is being abused in a situation, she can't, I guess, just file criminal charges and start court proceedings to get a divorce, but she has to go through a mediation where she sits face-to-face with the person she's accused of abuse. And what Ruth Marinas told me with the group Venancias is that many women lose their life in that process of mediation, just waiting for support, waiting for help. They can't just get, the police to take action. And Daniel Ortega signed that into law. So it's scary and really, I think, detrimental for many women, especially in the countryside, who are the most vulnerable.
We're pretty much out of time, but I have one more question. Are there many Nicaraguans among the streams of people who have been marching up to the American border from Central America, or are they mostly from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala?
Yeah, there haven't been as many Nicaraguans. And, in the past, throughout the Central American refugee crisis that we've seen in our country, you don't hear about as many Nicaraguans. And under Daniel Ortega, the government was relatively stable, and many Nicaraguans stayed. And, I think recently, since April, when violence broke out again in the country, and when protests against reforms by the pensions that Daniel Ortega had said he was going to implement, a lot of older people and students started marching. And then, from reports, the police or masked guards, paramilitaries opened fire on the crowds that were marching against these pension reforms. And so you've seen, in the last few months, the last 6 months specifically, you've seen a lot of people. I think at this point it's over 20,000 refugees in Costa Rica, Nicaraguan refugees. I think there's fear that there will be more coming.
Jenny Murray's film Las Sandinistas is currently being screened at the Film Forum on West Houston Street. How long is the run?
The run, it's a 2-week run, and it goes until December 4th, next Tuesday.
It's a must-see film, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Leonard. Have a great day.
And that brings us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to Jenny Murray, to Todd McGovern, who produced today's segment, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my producer, Jesse Lent, who helps make things run smoothly. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.